Welcome to Biota Live. I'm Tom Barbalet, and this is a continuation of the Biota podcast. You can get more Biota podcasts at biota.org/podcast. Now we have our first caller, so I'm going to pick up the first caller. Hello, first caller.
Hello there.
Are you calling in via a landline or via Skype? We have Gerald de Jong calling in from the Netherlands.
I'm calling in with Skype.
Terrific. So, Gerald, just to bring you up to speed with the process, I have a few news and notes to get on with, and then we'll get into the main discussion, although you may have something to add to the news and notes as well. So, for folks listening to this in the podcast, every Friday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, we hold a live radio show called Biota Live, where we discuss topics in artificial life. And today, as a first test, but possibly a monthly habit for the first Saturday of the month, we hold a 10 a.m. Pacific call-in to allow folks such as Gerald de Jong, whose Project Darwin at Home has been discussed in previous podcasts, to call in and participate. Now, next week's show at 8 p.m. Pacific on Friday is going to be with regards to books to the internet, and the idea that folks such as myself and Gerald and other folks that have participated in these podcasts previously got their primary sources for artificial life information through books, probably more than a decade ago, and now the best way to get artificial life information, primarily because there aren't books published, or so many books published on artificial life currently, is through the internet. So we're going to discuss the change and transition from books to the internet and whether books will be in the future what they have been in the past in terms of artificial life developer inspiration. In addition to this, Greysum News, as announced last night, there is going to be a Greysum London meeting Wednesday, 20th of February. We're still getting a location, and I will announce the location when we have it. For other folks listening to this live, you can call in. It's a US number, 646-200-0640. We're looking for all participants. I'm sorry, I forgot to open the chat window. The chat window is now opening. So if folks are eagerly waiting to participate in the chat, you can get to the chat through biota.org/podcast. There's a link through to the Blog Talk Radio site where folks can join the chat and ask questions if they don't want to make a US call. Now, Gerald, you timed your call particularly well because I was also going to discuss briefly Dick Gordon's book, which Bruce and I have been working on for, I guess, the past maybe 6 or 7 weeks. And it's quite an eclectic group of folk who normally wouldn't actively communicate. There are creationists and intelligent design folk and journalists and biologists and geologists and a wide variety of folk gathering together in a single book to discuss a wide variety of topics. Gerald, I know this is a particular passion of yours. Would you be interested in participating in such a book?
Why not?
Well, I'm gathering folks that are interested to pass back to Dick Gordon. He sent a request out recently to have more folks involved with the dialogue. As I said last night, I have participated, or in the process of participating, in 3 dialogues so far. The diversity of folk that are involved, I'm currently participating in a dialogue with a creationist who is talking about computer programming languages versus spoken languages as a proof for intelligent design, quite an interesting paper to critique. Where does one begin? I've also participated in dialogue with some astrobiologists who are extremely positive astrobiologists verging on panspermians, which filters into the Brigg-Kleiss discussion in the previous, I don't know, when did we interview Brigg? Gerald, do you remember, was it June last year? It was in that kind of time frame, maybe June even the year before. So these kind of folks, and I'm also in a dialogue with Dick Gordon himself about the way to communicate science, particularly in a heavily polarized, one particular group, intelligent design, creationists. And one of the curious things in this dialogue with Dick is that I propose that intelligent design as it is currently, capital I, capital D, intelligent design represented in a wide variety of creationist institutes, probably wouldn't agree with grassroots creationist belief. So we really are in that level of deconstruction currently. It's quite an interesting project in terms of bringing folks together that normally wouldn't be in communication and normally would avoid communication at all cost in some regards. So I've got to say hats off to Dick Gordon with regards to this book. Now, the number to call in for folks who are interested in participating, it's a US number, 646-200-0640, and there is also a chat room for folks who don't want to call in to the US but want to participate. Last night there were a number of folks in the chat room and they contributed a number of interesting questions, particularly with regards to logo and students programming and getting artificial life into education and these kind of questions. But the topic for today is artificial life for the next decade, which could go in a number of different directions. I know, Gerald, you have a particular topic that you'd like to discuss. So as you've called in via Skype, why don't you open up the discussion with your particular view?
About artificial life, or what exactly do you mean?
Well, the idea that the name is part of the problem.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's necessarily part of the problem. It's just that when you say artificial life, it's like you're creating life, but it just happens to be artificial, and I'm not sure it deserves the name life, because it depends on what you mean by life, but you can really sort of water down the meaning of life pretty easily if you say this little program that I wrote where there's a bunch of simulated individuals interacting with each other in a sort of an ecosystem that kind of stays in balance, and this is life. It really weakens the idea of what life is, I suppose.
Do you feel the same way with regards to artificial intelligence and intelligence?
Not so much, because intelligence is not, it's something that's a much stricter definition. Intelligence is, we've had things like the Turing test to determine intelligence and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say artificial intelligence is as, it's not watering down the idea of intelligence as much.
So we have, I believe, Justin Line calling in from the UK. Hello?
Hello, how are you doing?
Hey, welcome back, Justin. So I'm not sure how much of the conversation you've heard to date, but Gerald did email me prior to this radio show a couple of days ago, in fact, with regards to the idea that the term artificial life in some degree depreciates the term life primarily. I have my own views with regards to that, but what is your thinking in terms of the term artificial life being problematic, Justin?
Well, I'd like to obviously hear a little bit more of why he feels it's problematic before I would comment on that, I would imagine. Why do you think it's a bit problematic?
Okay, well, the whole idea is basically that life is something that is quite special. It's not something you find on every planet, and it's not something that it's quite bizarre that it all came about by the process of evolution through so much time, and then if someone gets on the computer and spends a couple of years or months or whatever, building some sort of synthetic ecosystem or some sort of population of creatures that interact with each other, and then they say this is life, it just happens to be artificial. It seems to me a very it's such an extremely limited form of life, if you can even call it that at all, that to say artificial life sort of waters down the idea of life.
I see what you... Go ahead.
Sorry, Justin. Go.
What I was going to say is that I respect that. And I had this come up when I gave my talk in Santa Monica, California, to the executives. And someone asked me the question, well, how do you define life? And my comeback was, well, bacteria, which doesn't have any sort of higher order consciousness, is a form of life. So, yes, artificial life as it's currently practiced might be a relatively minor form of life in the sense that, the same way that 4.2 billion years ago, the bacteria that was crawling around Earth was minor. But it's the sign that we can actually create these sorts of things, and then over time start to see them emerge into actual, potentially higher order life forms.
Could we take a few minutes and try and figure out what the what the characteristics would be? What are the things that how do we judge something to be either artificial life or not? I mean, you can take, for example, a simple cellular automaton like Conway's Life. That also used the name Life, of course, but you know it's an extremely simple system, as I'm sure you all know.
Certainly, Gerald. If I can just interrupt you, we have another caller, and then we will resume to. Let's see if the other caller.
Oh, it's Jeffrey.
Oh, hello, Jeffrey. Hello.
Hi.
I'm not sure how much of the conversation you've heard today. And apologies to folks in the podcast as well who are hearing the conversation being restated. But Gerald asked an interesting question, which I think leads into my comment back to Gerald with regards to what the qualities of life are with regards to the very basic early artificial life developments, Conway's artificial life, for example. And what I, in correspondence with Gerald, what I said back to Gerald was that artificial life should be thought of as a whole and proper name, that it is in fact a descriptive term that in fact refers to a wide variety of things which we now, to date, you know, may consider doesn't really represent what life is, but what we are doing here is in fact forming some kind of collective discourse amongst the practitioners of this thing that we're calling artificial life. Now, another interesting point that I made back to Gerald before I'll go back to talking about Conway is the idea that if we have the mechanism to change the name, for example, about 3 years ago we discussed the idea of artificial nature being a better descriptive term for what we were doing with Biota. If we could convince the broader public of this, I mean, this is the nature of a proper name. If you can change the proper name in popular culture, if you can get people to all agree upon using the new term, then you've actually done a lot of really productive good. I think for the contemporary hobbyist artificial life community, if I want to draw that kind of sphere around a group of people, would be in a much better place if they could actually communicate what this thing was that was whatever new term we pick, artificial nature, digital ecology, whatever you want to call it. Now, what's interesting as well is in parallel to talking about the future, we have Craig Ventnor talking about a particular aspect of what some of us may want to call synthetic biology, what some of others may want to call wet artificial life, who is pumping out in a kind of 2 weekly to monthly time cycle press releases which go out into the Associated Press and the broader science media, saying, I am developing artificial life, this is what it is synthetic biology, this is what the term means now. So in that context, what Gerald is talking about in terms of a renaming may actually be very pertinent because we may need to actually find a new name to distinguish ourselves from what Craig Ventnor is doing.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
My impression of what Venter is doing is that would be basically a legitimate usage of the phrase, because it's something that is made by people, but it very much resembles life because it's actually made from the same building blocks.
But is it actually functioning as life or simply molecular pieces of life?
I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what it's doing, but my proposal for the actual name of what we're doing, I thought of a while ago, and I think it still makes sense. Is simulated life, because if you're simulating, then Jeffrey, what would you call the stuff that you've been building for so many years? Would you call it life?
I think people call it artificial life because that's the easy buzzword to call it, but I tend to try to stay away from that as well because it's one of those terms that carries too many connotations, and I like to call it simulation because I think that's a better term.
And Tom, you as well call your system a simulation.
No, I think you have the majority. I'm waiting for Justin's casting vote whether or not we will continue to call it artificial life or whether we will adopt your new name. Justin, what's your thoughts?
I I rather like artificial life, but then again, I like being bold and somewhat fictional in some ways. And I think that if you look at Craig Ventor's comments, all he's doing is creating a synthetic chromosome, it's a sequence of DNA, and he's calling something as trivial as that life. And having cloned a gene myself, I know that it's non-trivial, but not completely impossible what he's talking about. And I think the things that we're doing with silicon is a different type of artificial life. Maybe it's not carbon-based in the sense of like TACG and all that, but it is very compelling, and therefore I think we should call it life.
Now we have a comment from Matt in the chat who says that Steve Grand made a distinction between artificial life and a-life. So I think Matt is making the point that perhaps a-life may be considered an additional term. And, I mean, as a minor point of consideration, I always like Steve Jobs' logic with regards to Apple Computer appearing earlier in the phone book than Microsoft, for example. So let's throw a-life in as a possible term as well. Gerald?
Yeah, I'd go for that. I like the term a-life.
Okay. So if we have a-life simulated life as a possibility, now this begs the question in terms of the next decade, and I'm going to talk a little bit with regards to Microsoft as well, because I think if Microsoft, through what they're already trying to do with artificial intelligence and robotics, makes the next logical sequence that they have simulated environments with intelligent agents moving through it, maybe they should start developing similar kinds of roads into artificial life that they're currently making with the AI and robotics community. This would also dramatically change the landscape with regards to what we're doing currently. So in that view, Gerald, what's your own thinking with regards to the current position of a-life development and the potential to move forward in the next decade? What do you see as the obstacles and what do you see as the possible rewards?
Well, one thing that really struck me about a half year ago was when I was talking to some people about robotics, and then after that I listened to several episodes of Talking Robots from Switzerland, that podcast. And one thing that really struck me was the idea of embodiment, that to really work out whether something is behaving in some sort of lifelike way, it has to be independent, it has to be sensing things, and it has to be living in the real world.
Essentially, it has to not be a simulation.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, exactly. And, you realize the more you play around with, virtual environments where you're simulating the physics and everything, if you busy yourself with simulating physics, you know how humble you have to be, because it's just not fair. You don't get to nearly do as much math as the universe does when it calculates the quantum states of the countless atoms around you. So it's to such an extreme degree fake. And so extremely limited, and you're spending much of the computing time actually, pretending that there's a space that something is moving around in. Whereas there have been examples of extremely, extremely simple, robotic systems that have, like 3 transistors or whatever, and they go towards the light, and when they're tired, they go and charge up and things like that. Dead simple behavior based on just the smallest number of silicon elements. And because of the embodiment, because of the simple fact that there are cameras and it's trying to or light sensors and it's trying to sense things and move around and things like that. It's a world of difference when the universe that your creatures are operating in is real.
Yes. Right. It's almost like a whole different category of artificial life.
Yeah, and it almost doesn't seem, it's kind of strange that it's so different, but it really is, and that's what struck me. Embodiment, when you actually have the creature in the real world, it's so different than in a simulated world.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some comments from the chat from Bob Mottram, long-time Biota listener, and also Steve Grand, devotee, who we hope to have in a future interview podcast, and Arthur Vanderbilt talking about robotics, that physics comes for free, which is just echoing what Gerald was saying. We are really here talking about hard artificial life. In terms of the distinctions between wet, soft, and hard, is this generally thought of with regards to the participants? Justin, do you think of these distinctions?
I agree, absolutely, in terms of the distinction between the simulated environment that exists completely in cyberspace, so to speak, versus, wet artificial life where you're actually building things, versus what I think it was Gerald that was talking about, the idea of these 3 or 4 transistors connected together that kind of mimic life in the real world. You're talking about the guy at Santa Fe that did that.
There's another
Los Alamos.
There's another distinction that I think is very interesting, and that is another kind of real environment, and that is the Internet, the network of intelligent people tapped into the Internet and forms of life. They're not living in the world of real physics, but they're living in the world of real information. And there are certain adaptive agents that can be a part of that, whether they're web crawlers or actual T-era life forms that move around. And I'm wondering if anybody's thought about that as another category.
That makes me immediately think of Tom Ray's stuff, where he actually created, you could call them sort of replicating creatures that were, native to the simulated environment, without any notion of physics, of course.
Right.
I mean, the thing about real life and the universe that we actually live in, we've got space to deal with, and if you simulate space, then you come across some really surprising disadvantages in that you have to deal with, and the fact, for example, there's no such thing as proximity, really. Proximity is something that you have to do a lot of work to make sure that it seems like it's working correctly. There's any kind of collision. That's a huge amount of work to do that right. Whereas in the real world, it's just it's free. And so Tom Ray's stuff, where he actually had creatures that lived in memory, and they didn't have any kind of 3-dimensional physics or anything like that. Their job was to replicate themselves. That seems like a native, and that was his argument as well. Like this is native to the silicon environment.
Right.
So Bob Mottram. Sorry, I just want to read out the chat to get folks participating in the chat as well. Bob Mottram is making a point that if one were to abstract all these things, there is something that is quintessentially about living processes that maybe the artificial life study is with regards to. So I think he's concerned that we're getting overly bogged down in the kind of applied end of things, when really we should talk a little bit more about the shared components of wet, soft, hard, and potentially, Jeffrey has coined a new term, Internet artificial life today. So what is the kind of collective thoughts? I'll start with Justin with regards to this.
Well, okay. Well, with respect to, I'm not sure I quite follow all the logic here, but from my perspective, if you have an artificial life that exists in the computer, in the form of a little ecosystem. So it's contained within a walled environment, if you will, and there's the whole issue around how do you get virtual creatures from one environment, one virtual ecosystem into another one. Without that, they're really constrained to that environment. It'd be like taking an animal from an off-world planet and trying to put it on Earth. It just would not survive. So the idea of creating like evolving viruses, for example, I know there's been a lot of work with DHS on that, the idea of, I just really strongly argue that if you develop a life form inside the computer, it's still as much of a life form, even though it isn't based on what humans are based on or animals are based on. It's still, in my mind at least, but I would be willing to argue whether or not that is the case or not. There's some very good points that are being made tonight, so it's challenging me.
Well, native creatures like Tom Ray's, I would find it easier to consider them to be like Internet life. But whenever you introduce space and movement in space to make it sort of more familiar to us, then it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and you really don't get to, the simulation is not anywhere, within millions of orders of magnitude close to what's actually happening in life. So it just seems so far-fetched.
In terms of Bob Mottram's point, if we take all these aspects that we're describing as artificial life, and I think what you're saying, Gerald, as well, is throwing in real life as well, real life organisms into that, is there some shared philosophical or theoretical component that can come from the development and study of all these aspects of artificial life? I'll put this question to Jeffrey first.
Oh, I believe there is, and that's why all of these things tend to be called artificial life. There are certain shared aspects of all of these things, and perhaps it's the functional aspect of artificial life, which separates it, abstracts it from the biological, the carbon, water-based, and sort of these abstract notions that we can talk about, perhaps that all of these things have in common.
So what are exactly the common elements? I mean, the things that I think of is like, evolution processes, survival of the fittest is something that's been sort of central to what I've been doing, but that's not necessarily the only focus. You can also think in terms of sort of metabolism, or ecosystem or metabolism.
Sure, we all pick our favorite. Piece of that, adaptation. And sometimes it's about physics, sometimes it's about reproduction. Yeah, I think they're all different aspects of it.
Sometimes it's about community and nurturing and raising young and these kind of things as well. And that certainly, if we're throwing our, fists in the ring with regards to the various components, that's always been an interest of mine as well. And I think what's fascinating here is we're getting a smorgasbord of different ideas that can all be parts of artificial life. Or I guess in the term simulated life, Gerald, you're really eliminating some of these things. I mean, wet artificial life I don't think is necessarily simulated life.
No, that would make the distinction. That wouldn't be simulated anymore. That would be artificial life. That would.
But how about hard artificial life?
Like embodied robotics or something.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's I don't know. It's definitely a different category. I'm not sure what it would best be called.
In terms of rounding up this discussion and looking at other issues, Justin, do you want to make any additional points?
I think I should just listen for a bit here and make sure I understand exactly, because I'm struggling to understand. To me, what I'm trying to say is that whether it's simulated, and I totally agree with the fact that there's orders of magnitude difference between the physics that we simulate in virtual systems versus what happens in the real world, and that's unambiguous and unarguable. But nevertheless, I think that from an experimental perspective, or from the perspective of understanding how things are unfolding, we can actually create a life form that exists inside a computer chip, and that has the elements of life the same way that a wet artificial life might have.
What's your thinking on that, Jeffrey?
One thing I like to compare it to is artificial intelligence, only in the sense of how that term and how the concept has evolved for us. When artificial intelligence was first introduced, it meant a certain thing. People thought of HAL computer and things of that. But now the term has loosened up, and we can use it more freely. We refer to things as intelligent or not intelligent, and perhaps the same may happen with artificial life. The very definition of life might become a little bit more loose and flexible. That's my only comment.
What's your thinking, Gerald?
Yeah, well, I always think of Tom Ray's stuff as a sort of an archetype of a real approach to having life inside of a computer, and also something like even the malicious viruses that spread around the internet.
Yes, yeah.
That's something you could consider a kind of life. The point is actually, life is something that comes about as a sort of a response to the challenge, to a particular challenge it's given. You and I have two eyes because we're particularly keen at judging distances because we once used to jump from tree to tree. we've developed the way we have because we've risen, or life has risen to a particular challenge given a particular environment. And if you think of a virus spreading around the internet, it is operating in an environment that it is, surviving in an environment that it's supposed to be, that it sort of arose from in a way. Whereas if you do, spatial things with collision and, 3D and stuff like that, then it's not life because it sort of didn't come from the place that it is. It's sort of been pushed into cyberspace, or it's been pushed into the computer, and it's, simulating something that we experience. But, it didn't come from there, and it's not really at home there.
I might even say that the creation of viruses might even be more of a life form than Tierra, because it grew naturally out of sort of human activity. They weren't trying to do artificial life, so it's even less intentional in that sense, more organic.
Absolutely.
Certainly. And I think, Gerald, what you have done is offer us a topic for the next Saturday matinee recording of Biota Live, because there are so many perspectives on this. From the chat room, Arthur Vanderbilt is writing that from this discussion, what is particularly fascinating is the idea that a diversity of simulators may come together through some shared platform and actually develop collective artificial life. I've always thought of that as interesting myself, particularly with regards to the venning between the hard artificial life and the artificial intelligence communities. But I think, Gerald, you started an interesting debate that I think most of us need to step away from and have a bit of a think about in order to continue with. I wanted to go through the participants currently on the line with regards to what they see happening in artificial life in the next decade. And I think from a historical perspective, Jeffrey, you're probably the best person to talk about this.
Where it's going in the next decade?
Yes.
Well, I think it's going in many different directions. The piece that I made, Gene Pool, is I specifically wanted it to be more educational, and it does have some physics and things of that sort. And it's kind of meant to inspire people to think about evolution and to have fun watching it. But I also think that there are other directions, like I mentioned before, internet artificial life, which will be very much embedded in the whole Web 2.0 environment of web crawlers and search engines and just basically the AI that grows out of the internet over time.
So this, in some regard, has both negative and positive connotations for artificial life in the future if we start getting associated with malware and things that are bringing down the internet and things of this nature. Although it may be very productive financially for us as well. It could be quite lucrative to be artificial life specialists going into this kind of dark cyberpunk future in some regard. Justin, what's your thinking with regards to the next decade of artificial life development?
I think that within the next 10 years, probably by 2012, we'll have the first beginnings of the virtual world in which core business processes for the Global 500 are managed by artificial life forms across the extended value chain.
So you don't think that is already happening through the internet? You don't think the internet is already doing some component of that?
Well, I think the internet is the enabling technology that allows us to turn data into information about what's going on in our global enterprises. But really, it's only with simulation science, the mapping of the physics of reality, that we start to have a semblance of understanding around the core business processes that drive our value chains across like in a supply chain, for example. And then if you look at the work at MIT or Santa Fe Institute, human beings do a crap job of managing complex adaptive systems. Consequently, the only real benefit or advantage is to actually turn that over to non-humans, that is the machines, and allow them to actually manage the value chains for Global 1,000 companies or Global 500 companies.
But you're currently saying that this isn't happening in a productive sense, but it may currently be happening in a way where they're not to the level of, I don't want to say cognizance, but in a means where they can actually do things in a productive way. Are we part of the way there currently?
Well, I mean, the biggest challenge is really the interoperability between simulations. Right now, all the simulations are being developed either with integrated development environments, or they're being created from scratch using whatever language you choose, your own language that you like, and they're not able to interact. So, for example, if I've got a simulation, if I use an oil company as an example, I've got a simulation of the reservoir, a simulation of the processes at the well, the simulation of the movement of the hydrocarbons out to, say, a boat, the transportation of that hydrocarbons to the refinery, all that sort of processes all the way out to the spot markets. Each simulation is in and of itself one self-contained environment, and they don't communicate amongst each other. What we've been working on is creating interoperability between those. Once we have the interoperability taken care of, then the artificial life form can come in and actually manage it across the value chain.
Okay, we have a question from the chat from Bob Mottram. He's asking whether the artificial life would actually be making business decisions in that context.
Define a business decision.
Well, it's one thing to maintain information, but it's another thing to make a choice that affects the livelihood of humans. It's one thing to do data mining and maintaining that.
I'd like to add something here because at the company I used to work at, we were working on multi-agent systems and many agent systems. So try to imagine a logistics system where every package in the system and every vehicle and perhaps driver and whatever else is an agent in the system, and they've all been programmed in a fairly ant-like way, so sort of dumb. They're not particularly intelligent in themselves. But what they do is they make deals with each other, and you sort of let them make deals with each other. You configure them up, and then you set them off to do what they have to do. So they make decisions on the fly. This allows for some really complex adaptive systems. For example, if some packages are traveling from one city to another because they've made a deal with the vehicle to carry them, and then the vehicle is broken, what happens then is that the packages discover that the vehicle they're in is no longer traveling, and they go and make deals with other vehicles to travel. Also, things like, for example, a vehicle might accept a package and make a deal with it to travel somewhere, and then later on get a more lucrative deal for something else, in which case it has to turn back it has to break its contract. And breaking a contract costs money. So now this package is exceptionally rich and able to arrange for itself some very fast transport to meet its goal after all. So these small-scale decisions can certainly be made by sort of less intelligent algorithms than you might think.
Certainly. And from the chat from Arthur Vanderbilt, and this comes to the important ethical considerations with regards to all of this. Arthur asks with regards to future physicians using biosimulations in medicine, and similarly with regards to actual large-scale financial transactions and things of this nature. But the one that is always used in ethics is artificial life robots or artificial life entities, be they AI or artificial life explicitly, that are used by the military in order to subdue or kill humans. And I think the concern with regards to all of these things had by a broader and perhaps less educated in the specifics of what we're discussing community, the general public, for example, is that when you start to talk about human life being mediated by artificial life, either through healthcare or through the military, and when you talk about your personal finances being mediated by an artificial life, these are things that draw immediate ethical concern from the general public. Justin, what's your thinking with regards to this?
Well, there was an earlier question which I didn't really answer, which is, yes, absolutely, the artificial life forms will make business decisions. Second, and they have to because humans do such a crap job of it. Second, the idea of having artificial life forms mediate with respect to, I think you mentioned healthcare and military, what's happening. In the military space, they're already Project Albert with the Marines and with some of the other projects that are ongoing with the Joint Advanced Warfighting Program. They're looking at the use of artificial life for a whole host of different management decisions or combat decisions. And in healthcare, I'm working on a project where we've already right now it's about 64,000 patient records, and we're expanding it to several million across different geographic regions, looking at having the artificial life engine actually identify patterns that drive down healthcare costs while simultaneously improving the quality of care.
Is it being called artificial life?
Absolutely, yeah. I just gave a big talk on it. It's the use of artificial life, an artificial life form which is smarter than humans in some ways. It's very, very dumb in many ways, but it's much smarter in other ways in terms of pattern recognition and stuff like that, with respect to exploring the treatment space. And all of these are proof of concept projects, very small projects, $250,000 projects, but they're not huge projects, but they're kind of paving the way for where we might go with these technologies, and it's getting the attention of the right people. And then it's just a matter of kind of communicating it to other economic buyers and continuing to promulgate these ideas and expand on.
Certainly, sorry, continue, Justin.
But I really do believe if you ever studied, there's a guy named Jay Forrester at MIT who developed something called system dynamics, and they were asking him. He always commented he's this most brittle, kind of arrogant prick you'll ever meet. He's a very tough professor, but he's also brilliant. And what he says, they were asking him is, why do people not listen to the advice that you give them that comes out of your computer simulations? And he said, well, it's because they didn't grow up with computers, and as soon as they die, these things will be taken up. And that's exactly what I think is going to happen, is that the people like myself who've grown up with this, I'm 35, who've grown up with computer, from my perspective, I know that humans are terrible at complex adaptive systems management. So consequently, I would much rather have computers take care of it. It would, it certainly reduce things like demand amplification or the bullwhip effects in supply chains.
Wait, what you're sort of saying is complex adaptive systems. I mean, you've said twice now that complex adaptive systems are badly managed by people, and I'm thinking complex adaptive systems manage themselves, don't they?
Which might be part of his point. But I think, if I may add a point, I think that humans should always be the final decision makers in these things, and that our artificial life forms and our artificial intelligence systems always will help us make those decisions. I think it's AI or IA, intelligence amplification, as what's his name? I forgot his name. Who used that term rather than AI. It's a cybernetic enhancement to humanity, as everything else is, to help us be the final decision makers on things, and these artificial life forms can help bring those decisions to us so that we can make them.
I think there's also something to keep in mind here. There are very, very different kinds of decisions. There are tiny decisions, there are micro decisions, and there are macro decisions. And I agree with you, Jeffrey, with respect to macro decisions. But I'm quite convinced that as time goes on, more and more decisions will be made by, the micro decisions will
by
be
the
made
little ants crawling around. Yes, all those little ants will make the micro decisions.
Exactly.
And there will be more and more of them.
And the ethics are not really an issue, because these things are sort of too stupid to be ethical, but they do operate quite nicely. And the nice part comes from the emergent behavior, when you've got large numbers of dumb things interacting with each other. That's also more stable than something like someone's invented super intelligent system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Completely with what you just said.
There's got to be diversity. There's got to be diversity in the system, And for example, a system should consist of programs written by hundreds of different people.
Right, with different viewpoints.
So I'm going to play.
Then you can trust the micro decisions to little programs, because everybody's got their own little workers.
Mm-hmm.
Would the marketing jargon be something like swarm intelligence or something like that?
Swarm has a very negative connotation with regards to locusts and things like that. I think in the general public, swarm, you don't want to be part of a swarm of anything or be subjected to a swarm. There are 2 points that are coming through here. I think in terms of visionary sense, we have a group of idealists here collected But in practical terms, economics tends to play how many thousand programmers are working on a particular piece of code at any one time. I think the ethical concerns, if I may return to them, relate to how an increasingly small group of people are holding this knowledge, and in demonstrations with regards to these kind of things, and this is where Justin is at literally the bleeding edge in terms of going out into industry and government and getting them thinking about these kind of issues in a very positive sense. But in terms of people or the general public that may look on this in a particularly negative light, the history with regards to computerization in terms of what it did to the workforce, I found this particularly growing up in Australia, particularly with a Luddite family that hated the thought that these computer things were. I was the complete rebel of the family in this regard. In fact, in every
rebel nerd.
Yes, exactly. In every decision I made, it was against my family's blessing in this regard. Well, in fact, in most regards. But the thing that interests me is the way that we as intellectuals can gather together on a telephone call, a live radio show, and discuss these things indefinitely. But the thing that has shown itself, particularly in the past decade, if we look at what happened around 2000, 2001, is that technical visionaries aren't always put in positions of power. I like the idea that the small things, getting the little things done correctly, enables humans to think on the bigger things. This is the dishwasher metaphor with regards to technology, that once you have the dishwasher working, once you have electric lights, once you have all these kind of things, you can sit down and play, Quake Infinity for as long as you want. And I like that idea in terms of artificial life developers going through folks, visionaries such as Justin, in terms of communicating with commerce and with government. Justin, for artificial life developers that may be listening to this program as a podcast, what advice would you give, aside from contacting you directly, in terms of communicating the shared vision with regards to artificial life into the next decade?
I think they need to participate in these forums. I think that I just spent about the past 2 days going through your source code on Noble 8, and that's pretty amazing stuff. I think if they just participate on these calls and join the forums and join the Biota movement, or whatever you want to call it, I think that's where it'll come from. And then, the people that are slower will catch up on it, and then eventually the journalists will start writing about it, and the people that write the checks will start buying it because they figure out they can make more money, and that's really all they care about.
I think what's interesting, if we look at the current situation, particularly with the likes of Microsoft and Craig Ventner's involvement in contemporary artificial life in terms of getting messages out to, through Associated Press, through the popular science community, this is something we as artificial life developers need to really think about very heavily in terms of getting our kind of collective message, which isn't currently being represented in the general public's thinking. In fact, the fascinating part of the audio that I put up, and I'm sure all of us have listened to the Biota audio from Will Wright's questions, was that Will Wright has a perspective on artificial life, and I talked to Bruce Damer about this directly, which is pre-blind watchmaker in terms of a lot of what he is thinking about. So if Will Wright, someone who we may consider as an inspirational visionary in popular culture, at least with regards to the ideas that we're trying to propagate, cannot participate in some degree in terms of the discussions that we're having currently, we need to think about, firstly, finding these visionaries in the broader community. Will Wright is a good example, but also folks such as Gerald and my good friend Professor Dawkins, in terms of people of this caliber who are willing to take the seed idea of what we are doing in artificial life and actually communicate it to the broader public. This in some sense vends into next week's topic with regards to moving from books to the internet, and the idea that the internet is very good if people have the prior interest or some niggling interest. The internet's wonderful if you've got a few minutes free and you want to explore a particularly obscure area, and lots of folks stumble upon artificial life resources through this very process. But in terms of a long-term history, a sense of communication which seems to impact on the broader public, there is still something in the published written word which has a degree of impact. Perhaps it's academic searchability. Who can really tell? In terms of communication, Jeffrey, I know you've had a wide variety of experiences in terms of communicating what you were doing at any given time. Can you talk with regards to this?
As far as communicating artificial life?
Well, you've had an experience both through commercial companies, through academic publication, and also as an independent developer in terms of communicating your ideas. And certainly your ideas have filtered through popular consciousness through things like the PlayStation 3 game Flow and these kind of things, which are quintessentially Ventrella in their forms. What is your thinking with regards to how we actively communicate our collective visions out to the broader public?
Well, I think that the game community and people who put their mind in the space of games have a certain ability to move on to artificial life forms, because games already have agentry. They have autonomous pieces of code that you interact with, and that helps lead you to higher concepts. And so I think gene pool and some of these evolutionary programs are easy to think about, and that, of course, leads to other thinking. And so I think making Darwinian evolution more accessible and communicative for people is a good thing. That's my only comment.
But in terms of, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to listen to the Will Wright audio. I mean, Will Wright is a very high-level communicator in this regard, and he doesn't make that communication with regards to artificial life specifically. Obviously, your experiences at Linden Labs are very different in terms of working at a kind of a diversity of grassroots programmers that may never actually have the kind of exposure and publicity, and certainly my experiences with Apple and Intel ring with that as well, that there are a number of us in our kind of level of communication, even though we kind of peep of the turret in order to talk on a live internet radio show occasionally, who all share this belief. The problem is actually getting someone of the level of Will Wright, or maybe pushing someone up of our ilk who can communicate in this regard to a general audience and actually carry through this narrative, which is currently being lost in collective popular consciousness.
At the moment, he might be acting as a mouthpiece for Electronic Arts and sort of promoting the game, and so that may be affecting how he's communicating. I don't know if that addresses what you're asking.
Do you think there's a natural distinction that a company like Electronic Arts would want to make with what we are, hobbyist artificial life community? Do you think that as a commercial entity, Electronic Arts doesn't want to actually give us any lip service? Is this what you're saying?
No, that's not necessarily what I'm saying, but I do think that Electronic Arts has had, and this might be why it has taken so long for Spore to come out, is that Electronic Arts has a lot of people involved from the games industry who are very strongly oriented towards crafting a game very, very with a lot of top-down control. And so in artificial life, this is an experience I had at Rocket Science Games, that it's a whole different paradigm. Emergent bottom-up design is a difficult thing for a company.
Certainly, my experience in communicating with these higher-level THQ, EA, these kind of companies at a higher-level management side of things is that they are all excited by the kind of stuff that we develop as hobbyists, but the feedback I've always received is if only there was an artificial life SDK, if only you could gather together this kind of collective resource into something that we could easily plonk in our games that had been tested, that had, the benefits in some regard of lots of hands on open source, all these kind of things. And certainly in my own discussion I've published on the Grayson blog with regards to this recently, if we can get together and actually create an artificial life SDK, I don't see any of the kind of vertical integration management problems occurring once we have one company like THQ or EA willing to sign up to a single, not necessarily AAA title that uses this engine in some regard. Justin, you were going to say something.
Well, what I was going to say is that I do agree. I think, was it Jeffrey that said that about the idea of a top-down design?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I do agree that, I listened to Will Wright's comments, and it smacks me very much of the whole intelligent design versus evolution by natural selection debate, where Spore is nothing more than intelligent design codified into a game, whereas true artificial life is about creating evolution by natural selection, which might take, days and days of very boring, from a gaming perspective, activity.
Right. So I made the point last night, and I'm not sure if we've had the opportunity to hear last night's recording, but if you have 1,000 monkeys at 1,000 typewriters, not in any way to deprecate community online game players, you will get random noise. And if you have 1,000 participants creating creatures and then putting them all in a shared environment, the human becomes in some regard, the natural selection pressure, although the environment itself, in terms of how they're battling or what have you, is also part of that pressure. So the idea of intelligent design, as I understand it now, particularly working through Dick Gordon's book, capital I, capital D, Intelligent Design, is that there is a single designer. It's not a situation where Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Will Wright, Richard Dawkins, Steve Jobs get together and do the designing individually. It's with regards to a single intelligent designer. And I
would love to hear Dawkins' comments on what you just said.
You may notice that there's a history through these recordings of me putting little jabs out in order to get the good professor's participation. It's been a continuous narrative, so it's subtle in some cases and not so subtle in others. But the idea that what Will Wright is doing is intelligent design, I think, is fundamentally wrong, because it negates the idea that if you have thousands of participants, you don't, unless, of course, they're all using some agreed-upon rules which are completely separate, you don't actually have what the capital I, capital D intelligent design folk are talking about, which is quite divergent if you actually explore what they're talking about in some regard. But what you have with Spore, if you rewrite perhaps or look at the idea of the micro rules of selection and how this works in kind of broader communities, is in fact something which is probably in some road between capital I, capital D intelligent design and pure evolution, probably closer to the evolutionary end just through the number of participants. So I don't want it to be thought of as a truism that when you have an individual that is designing a creature that then puts it back into an environment, you have intelligent designers, capital I, capital D intelligent designers talking about. You actually have something that's a bit different and actually quite an interesting study in and of itself in terms of how this fits into the kind of evolutionary spectrum. Now, I know, Gerald, you and I have jammed on this in the past. What's your current thinking with regards to this?
Well, one thing I would like to say is that I don't think intelligent design even deserves airtime.
Very much so, yes.
But on the other hand, a lot of what we're doing you could call intelligent design, so let's have fun doing it, but let's not consider it to be a proof of anything or consider it to be even much of an analogy of anything. We talked about this before as well. I mean, we can intelligently design all we want. We're not going to be doing real evolution, so let's design some of it and let some of it evolve and make it a working together between two things. Aesthetic selection, for example, is partly intelligent design, but don't draw an analogy to what happened in nature. That's just the God of the Gaps story. It's silly.
Certainly. No, Gerald and I agree fully with regards to this. I think what interests me is the idea that there are a number of evolutionary models which can be played with and experimented with, particularly with regards to social models. And this is where, if you talk about memetics and these kind of ideas, there are a different kind of dynamic that exists when you have a group of people communicating that continue to live, whose ideas may change, that continue to come back together. This is a different kind of evolutionary process than traditional Darwinian evolution, surely.
With respect to ID, you said, why would you not even give it any time? Is that what you said? Why?
Why would I not give it any time?
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you completely, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm just happy to talk about what we're doing as intelligent design. That's not a problem at all. But to actually, revive the term and say, intelligent design people, the people who, consider that to be the origin of biology, give us a break.
No, I agree, and this is what concerns me with regards to our use of intelligent design to mean something completely different to the capital I, capital D. Now, for the participants on the call, I need to let you know that we've actually gone into overtime, which means that the call has continued to be recorded, so we can actually shell this one out for as long as we like. But if you have any reason that which you have to go, I mean, please let me know as well. But we're now still recording, I think probably for another hour, but we are actually over time technically.
Tom, I'll be going now, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your participation, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you. So for the remaining participants, we probably opened a hornet's nest too close to the conclusion of the Natural Radio Show. I'm willing to continue if you two are in some regard, but we have kind of left the productive format as well. I think there are a number of interesting points with regards to what we've raised. Gerald, do you want to conclude your thoughts with regards to this show with the view that we'll do another one in a month's time?
Well, one thing that we should talk a little bit more at some time with Bruce about is the idea of introducing more artificial life or a-life, whatever, things into virtual worlds, because virtual worlds are sort of relatively, static right now, and that's probably something that's going to happen in the coming decade. There's going to be more and more, when you go into a virtual world, there's going to be more and more sort of stuff happening around you, and hopefully on the basis of evolution. The stuff I'm working on right now, I'm trying to apply evolution to architecture, specifically focusing on tensegrity. And what I found out that I'm doing is basically I'm trying to grow plants. So this is another form of, you could call it artificial life, I suppose, or a-life.
You could be growing buildings in the near future as well.
That's the whole plan, actually, yeah.
I thought what Gerald was saying was absolutely phenomenally interesting, and I'd really like to hear more of what he has to say, if he has time.
Well, go for it. What do you want to know? What do you want me to say?
Well, I mean, I'd like to know a little bit more about your thoughts around, artificial life and the implications for things like intelligent design with the capital I and the capital D.
Yeah, well, see, that's one thing I would really want to stick to. We can, whatever we're doing in this artificial domain, I don't see it having the slightest impact on our interpretation of what happened in the context of biology. I mean, the fact that we are constructing, ecosystems or metabolisms or evolutionary systems, we are intelligently designing things. That's a given, and everybody who looks to, for example, my evolution stuff as a proof that evolution happened in biology is barking up the wrong tree. The analogy is just simply not strong enough. So
perhaps we've come full circle, Gerald, because I know you've used intelligent design in jest in some of your previous work. Perhaps we've come full circle on the term intelligent design for what we're doing because it's being used and misrepresented by others. Perhaps we need a different term instead of intelligent design that we use to describe what we're talking about here.
I'm actually in favor of co-opting the term.
So a kind of guerrilla movement, which we could be doing with artificial life as well.
Exactly.
We've come full circle. So, in doing this, Justin, do you have any final thoughts for the recording?
Well, I think it would be a very good conversation to continue. I think there's rich material here that is yet to be mined, and I would enjoy very much talking about this in more detail even now or later.
Yeah, I think for the benefit of the recording public, or the people listening to this in podcast form, their ability to participate is also critical as well. So this is one reason why I want to conclude this prematurely, is just to give others the opportunity to participate at some future time. So I'd like to, firstly I'd like to plug Gerald's Darwin at Home project. Gerald, you're moving into architecture now. You're going to be pumping out new podcasts in February. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I spent my first day this past Friday at my friend's office, which is a lovely architect's office overlooking the Maas River in Rotterdam, and it was wonderfully inspiring to be there, to see them do their work, and also to have discussions with them at lunch. And they were absolutely fascinated by the story of evolution, which they obviously don't have much contact with yet, but I'm going to introduce that for sure. I'm probably going to get some more attention in the architectural community eventually. And at the same time, I spent my first day working for the full day on the software, and I made some discoveries basically by running into brick walls and discovering what I couldn't do. So it's progressing well, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how far this can go in the architectural context.
Fascinating. And for folks in that realm who would like to make similar offers to artificial life developers, I think there is a long queue behind Gerald that would be interested in doing the same. It's actually funny, if we can just continue this a little bit, talking about brick walls. I did a recent release of the Noble Ape simulation, and it's at this point where either you're doing something productive like doing a release or planning for a release that you actually find these brick walls more than the kind of general day-to-day tinkering, which I find particularly interesting personally. Now, Justin, February is going to be a busy month for you with regards to Grey Thumb. Do you want to talk about some other stuff you're doing, or do you want to talk about Grey Thumb specifically?
Either way. Grey Thumb is coming up the 20th of this month of February. We'll be having it here in central London. I look forward to seeing lots of people there. And then in terms of other things that I'm working on, it's primarily client work.
Right.
Happy to go into if you want to hear about it.
Well, if there's anything of particular interest to a kind of general audience you want to discuss, feel free.
I think one of the interesting things, there's two things I'm working on. One is a very large gas company which is struggling with the complexity of their machines coupled with human systems. We're actually modeling out the physics of that entire virtual system. It exists in the real world, but we're modeling it in a simulation in the hopes of actually improving it. And for the military, there's a tremendous amount of work interested around less to do with artificial life and more to do with creating realistic simulations at a ray tracing level. So those are the two things I'm working on right now in the UK and the US. I think I tend to think that artificial life is at the point now where people like Gerald and Jeffrey and yourself, Tom, are kind of really at the forefront of an emerging medium that people are finally beginning to understand. What I mean by people, I mean the economic buyers who have budgets. And so it's a really good time to be dramatically helping our society improve itself.
So the next decade is looking very rosy for artificial life development.
I believe so personally, just based on the conversations that I've been having as I travel around the world. It's been, people are finding it. This is why I was so intrigued by Gerald's comments, is that I still run into occasionally fundamental philosophical, one might even say religious issues. So I look at things like Dennett and Dawkins and their viewpoints on life and the evolution of life, and contrast that with other groups and their viewpoints, whether they're Christians or Muslims. And I find it to be quite an interesting dynamic with respect to sales and marketing and business. Certainly.
So a number of topics raised, a number of future Biota Lives to cover. We may even have another one on Saturday, because I think Gerald's participation is particularly good out of the usual monthly cycle. So I'd like to thank you both, and also Jeffrey Ventrella, for participating. This has been Biota Live, normally recorded 8 p.m. Pacific on a Friday night, but specially today for European and East Coast listeners such as Gerald. Thank you both very much.